Welcome. This is the first lecture in Introduction to Cognition at Acadia University. So I'll start the lecture by just trying to define cognition. And, you might have some sense about what I mean when I say cognition. Maybe you're thinking about the mind or thinking itself. But cognition in a general way is actually really hard to define. It's like trying to define the concept of sweetness. We sort of know examples of sweet things, but it's hard for us to specifically sort of define what sweetness is. And so when we talk about cognitive psychology, when we talk about cognition, we tend to talk about the various psychological processes that make up a human cognitive mind. And that's what we're going to do in this class. So we'll talk about, for instance, perception, what you're doing right now, seeing images and words on the slide in front of you in this video. Language understanding. Again, I'm producing language and you're perceiving language. This is a cognitive process. And so in this class, we'll look at the various cognitive processes that make up a human mind. So what does cognition consist of? It consists of things like perception, perceiving your world. Actions, and you may think that, action doesn't play a huge role in thinking, but actually it does. The way you act or move in your world actually shapes your perception of your world, as we'll talk about in this class. Attention, so what's the role of attention in perception, memory, and understanding? Memory, retaining information, super important, for learning, right? There's no reason to learn if you can't remember things. Thought and the relationship between thought and language. So we tend to think using language in this course. We'll talk about that relationship and we'll talk about, what language is. And then finally, decision making and reasoning. So how, using all of the information that's available to us, we make rational decisions or not in our world. So these are the various areas of study within cognitive psychology, and each of these components makes a cognitive human mind. Now the key idea sort of underlying all areas of cognition, all areas of cognitive psychology, whether or not you're studying perception, action, attention, or language, is that cognitive psychologists believe in mental representations. So what's a mental representation? Well, think about the layout of your childhood home. Think about that memory, all the nooks and crannies of, where you grew up. This is a mental representation. You can actually imagine yourself sort of walking around your childhood home and exploring it. Cognitive psychologists believe in mental representations, and simply defined, a mental representation is an image, rule, symbol, or verbal concept in your mind that reflects some sort of external reality. So for instance, when I say the word cat, I'm actually using language to drive a mental representation in your mind. I say cat, this makes you think of a cat, a picture of the animal on the screen. And, not only do you have that image in your mind, but you understand the relationship between cats and other animals. You might know that, cats are very common in YouTube videos, or cats can be smelly. You know how to use the word cat in a sentence. So mental representations are ideas, symbols, rules, or verbal concepts that exist in your mind, and importantly, they reflect some sort of external reality. And all cognitive psychologists believe in mental representations. Now you might be thinking, isn't this obvious? Isn't it obvious that I have, an internal world in my mind? I can think about things. I can remember the past. I can plan for the future. Well, it's actually, not necessarily true that these mental representations contribute to our behavior. And there was a whole movement in psychology known as behaviorism, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, that actually proposed that these mental representations were effectively meaningless, and that all of our behavior, all of our psychology could be explained by stimulus-response relationships. So learning to sort of associate patterns in our world with particular behaviors. And again, we'll talk about behaviorism and why it's it's not that it's wrong, it just doesn't capture all of our psychology because it leaves out this important idea. It leaves out the idea of a mental representation. Okay, so in this class, we're going to study cognition, cognitive psychology, at 3 different levels. And this approach was really pioneered by a cognitive neuroscientist who worked at Cambridge named David Marr. David Marr is very famous for studying the visual system and visual processing. So how we perceive our world visually and take visual signals to form, internal representations of what we think is happening in our world. Now, to Marr and to almost all cognitive psychologists, the mind is an information processing system. We'll talk a little bit about, what information processing is in the next lecture, but the idea here is that the mind processes information in stages to build up mental representations, to build up images, rules, concepts in the mind that reflect some sort of external reality. Okay, so it's not like that you just look at your world and suddenly, there's images in your head reflecting what's happening in your world. There's actually a process here in which your mind is sort of reconstructing the visual world that it sees around you. Marr believed that the mind was an information processing system, and to him, to know about, to learn, to study any information processing system, we must examine it on at least 3 different levels. Okay, this is known as Marr's tri-level framework. And so that's the approach we're going to take in this class. And the first level, Marr called the computational level. And this word computation, it can often throw students off because it sort of makes you think about, computers and math. But really, what Marr was interested in are the computations, the problem that the system or cognitive process is trying to solve. Okay, what are the inputs? What are the outputs? So another way to, or how I like to think about this level is simply, this is behavioral analysis, looking at human behavior, looking at cognition, and simply describing it. What is memory for, right? What is language for? What is attention for? This is a computational level description of those psychological processes, and we'll work through some examples in a second. The second level of analysis in Marr's framework was known as the algorithmic level, or Marr called it the algorithmic level. And the idea here is this is sort of like the model or mathematical representation of the cognitive process, the algorithm, okay, that describes the cognitive process in a very general way. And in this class, we'll look at a lot of different models of cognition, a very famous model of attention, for instance. And as cognitive psychologists, we love to build models because models allow us to make new predictions about, how the mind might work. And so if we're building a model of a cognitive process, we're sort of operating at this middle or algorithmic level. And then the third level of analysis that Marr proposed is the implementational level. So how is the cognitive system physically realized in the brain, right? So any cognitive process is driven by the firing of neurons in your brain. That's just necessarily true, okay? And so the neuroscience behind cognition reflects the implementation of a cognitive process. So let's look at an example. Imagine we wanted to apply, Marr's tri-level framework to an explanation of like what a car is and what it does. So the first thing we would do is describe a car at a computational level. And again, you can think of this as sort of behavioral analysis. What is a car good for? What problem does it solve? What are the inputs and what are the outputs, right? Gasoline or electricity, and the output is force, the wheels pushing against the road to move the car forward. Okay, so that's a computational level description of a car. The next level of analysis would be the algorithmic level. What are the representations or algorithms that allows the car to operate? What's the mathematical model? So this is where we might want to start thinking about, equations, Newton's laws, force equals mass times acceleration. And then finally, how is the system physically realized? So what are the mechanics of a car's engine that allows it to do, what it does? So this is applying Marr's tri-level framework to a description, to an understanding of a car. Again, we're going to use this approach throughout the course. Let's take a cognitive process like language. We can do the same thing, right? So if we can talk about language at a computational level or a behavioral analysis level, what do we use language for? Communication, okay, exchanging ideas. At the algorithmic level, we can talk about the rules that govern how we combine words in a language, right? We might call this grammar or syntax if we're talking about sentences. And then finally, we can look at, language in the brain, right? Because all language use, be it production, what I'm doing now, or perception, what you're doing, comes from the firing of neurons in the brain. And so we can ask, is there dedicated neural circuitry for language in your brain? And as we'll learn in this course, the answer to that question is yes, there is to some extent. So again, I'm going through this because in this course, this is how we're going to tackle all of the different cognitive processes that make up a mind. Okay, we're going to talk about perception at the computational level, at the algorithmic level, and at the implementational level. We're going to talk about attention at the computational level, the algorithmic level, and the implementational level, and so on. Why is this important? Why do we do this? Well, as Marr, famously stated, if you really want to understand any system, okay, be it a cognitive system or something else, like how a bird flies, you have to study it at each of these levels. Okay? Imagine trying to understand bird flight by simply studying the makeup of feathers under a microscope. You probably wouldn't come to a deep understanding of how a bird flies. The only way to really understand how a bird flies is to actually observe it behaviorally, like what's the purpose of flying, right? That's your computational level description. Work out the algorithm, so how does it actually keep itself, aloft? And then finally, you can look at, the neuroscience or the physiology of bird flight, and that will give you a complete understanding of the system. And so this is the approach we're going to apply to cognition in this course. Very quickly, let's foreshadow some of the themes in the course. Okay, so one of the key themes in the course is, how do we perceive and make sense of our world given referential ambiguity and noise in sensory systems? And so if these words don't make sense, that's completely fine. I'll define them in future lectures. But very quickly, we look at our world and we think it's sort of an accurate representation of, what's happening around us. But really what we're doing is we're interpreting a pattern of sensory stimulation on our retinas. And it really is just an interpretation. Okay, we're trying to come to sort of our best guess as to what's happening in the world, but to some extent, sensory signals are kind of ambiguous. And it's possible that, our guess is wrong. To complicate the issue, there's often noise in sensory signals. Okay, so think about talking to somebody like in a noisy room, like at a party, for instance. You have to understand their speech amongst this background noise. How does the brain, accomplish that task? So we'll look at this idea in this course. We'll look at the role of attention in perception, memory, and cognition. Do you have to attend to your world in order to perceive it? This is a very famous illusion of attention. It's known as change blindness. So in every flicker of the image, about 20% of the image disappears and then reappears. And if you haven't seen it, you're probably scanning around the image looking for the changing element. I can draw your attention to it. So it's the airplane's engine, and then suddenly you see the change and you're very aware of it. And you're sort of thinking like, how did I not see that? It's just so obvious. Well, this demonstration of change blindness shows the importance of the role of attention in perception. And so we're going to take a deep dive into attention in this class and, look at the importance of attending to your world. Okay, you have to attend to your world in order to perceive it. If you're not paying attention, you're literally going to miss things that are happening in your world. We'll look at memory. What is memory? Are there different types of memories? How do we store information? How do we retrieve information? What's the best way to study for this class and do well? We'll look at patients who have suffered brain damage and lost some of their memories and what that tells us about memory in the brain. We'll look at language. I'll talk about the relationship between language and thought, right? We often think using language. We have an internal monologue, or at least most of us do. We'll look at psycholinguistics, so the study of the psychology of language. Language, I believe, is very unique to humans, and it really gives us, in my view, sort of heightened cognition. And then finally, we'll end the class by looking at decision making, and we'll tackle the question, are we rational thinkers? Are we rational decision makers? Are we really good at interpreting evidence and making rational decisions? And the short answer is that we're not that great at it, but as I'll discuss in those 2 lectures, there are reasons for why we're not that great at it, and we can actually become better decision makers by knowing a little bit about how we think. Okay, so I tend to end every lecture with a short quiz. This quiz does not count at all, okay? It's simply to review and test your knowledge, to test sort of what you've retained from this particular lecture. As you'll learn in this class, the best way to actually retain information after you've learned it is to simply test yourself over and over and over again, as opposed to sort of like passively reviewing material. And so that's the purpose of these quizzes. I'll read out a question. You can pause the video if you like and try to answer it, and then I'll talk about the answer. Okay, so question 1, true or false? Mental representations are images, rules, or verbal concepts in the mind that reflect an external reality. True or false? And the answer, of course, is true. And if you're struggling to get the concept of a mental representation, just think about any memory, right? Like what you did yesterday, and you have some sort of image in your head. That is a mental representation. Now, mental representations can be more abstract, right? We all have knowledge of grammar. We're all able to form grammatically correct sentences at will. That knowledge is a mental representation, and critically, cognitive psychologists believe in mental representations. Okay, name David Marr's 3 levels of analysis. So David Marr famously said that to understand any cognitive system, you have to study it on at least 3 levels. What are those levels? So name David Marr's 3 levels of analysis. We have the computational level. And again, computational, don't get hung up on that word. Just think about, behavioral observations, right? What is the system doing? What's it good for? Then the algorithmic level. So what's the model or rule that governs how the system operates? And then finally, the implementational level. What's the neuroscience, right? Because fundamentally, all of our cognition must come from the firing of neurons in your brain. Okay, question 3, and this is the dreaded application question. I love to ask questions like this. Robin, a memory researcher, has participants remember words and shapes. Robin observes little interaction between these 2 categories of memory. At what level of analysis is Robin studying memory at? Okay, so Robin's running some sort of experiment, and participants are having to remember words and shapes, and he observes that they're able to do this without these 2 memories interacting or interfering with each other. Okay, at what level of analysis is Robin examining memory at? And the answer to this question is the computational level. So this is a behavioral description of memory. Robin is simply observing human behavior. He's looking at how different types of memories interfere or not in this case. This is a computational level description of memory. All right, I will see you in lecture 2 on the history of cognitive psychology.